Good morning, everybody. You're doing a little envelope hem this morning. I had mentioned in the last video and wanted to reinforce this that after the last video, you are in pretty decent shape as far as having the information and tools that you need to get a business up and running, coming from that creative perspective and wanting to do it, in a way that works for you and also is as budget friendly as possible. I feel like, as artists, a lot of times we're used to not having much budget. But it is intimidating, and the more you read, the more intimidating it gets. And so hopefully you've got some ideas for the way to get forward and get launched and get going, and you've started on things, and I've hit on all of those topics well enough that now my goal is to go back and address some of it again, like the next steps, so to speak, on a lot of the videos that we've already, chatted about, a lot of the subject matter that we've already chatted about. And what are those next steps? I have some of the videos that I very much focused on. This is how you get started. This is the beginning of it. Sorry, I need to pull this off the hanger. For me to get it to go under the machine, right? Okay. Sorry. You sew and you record, and sometimes the dress doesn't want to go under, right? So here you are. Okay, so then we back up now. Well, let's back up and take a look at the things that we've already talked about, and that once you've done the beginner step, what the steps are after that, as you grow. And I am still very much growing myself, so I don't necessarily have every answer to every bit of it, but I do have some things, some information, at least those next steps on almost everything that we've talked about. And so, I'll offer up what I can to get you out of that next step and on your way to knowing how to do all of that building. So one of the first videos was about getting a name for your business. And so at this point you've done that, and at this point you've got some business cards and you've got your name registered with the state. So you're set up to do all of the things that the state requires you to do, and you are able to keep that name going into the future, that name is going to work going into the future, and that you've decided on a type of business, whether it's an LLC or however you do it, that how that works for you the best. And then now the next thing that we're going to deal with again. All right. I finally dug around in this dress long enough to get done what I needed to get done. So what's after that? Well, I can tell you the next thing, and this was a thing that I struggled with for a while, for me personally, was a pretty significant issue as I started to move forward, was my workspace, where I was working at, where the fittings were happening at, how all that was going to happen. I had been working from home. Like I mentioned before, it was not the most ideal situation, but it's more important just to get started. It's important to just start the thing. And so I was already pretty aware that it was a short-term solution, and people were very nice about it. And like I said, I didn't mind having people in my home, but my home, in retrospect, it is what it is. If I would have been thinking about the possibility of having a workplace out of my home, if I would have been in a different budget category for buying my home, I would have purchased a home that more easily could have converted into having, a separate entrance, or, some place like that you could more easily run a business out of it. My home is not set up that way. The floor plan isn't set up that way. It's, it was just not going to be a great situation for me having clients over. They had to walk through my living room to get to the area where they were fitting. There wasn't a really good fitting area. I was working out of my dining room, and like a lot of dining rooms, it was very open to the rest of the house. So I was having to figure out random things. The bathroom is upstairs, so it wasn't even like I had a convenient restroom to let people change in that. Although, honestly, there comes a point in time where, trying to shove, a wedding gown fitting into somebody's half bath in the hallway is not great either. So, at some point, you're going to need to figure out if that space is working for you. Obviously, it was more convenient. Now, I know too that a lot of people struggle with how, it's hard to work out of your home because it's hard to make that delineation between home and work. I didn't struggle with that a whole lot. The only thing that I ever struggled with really is that I was having to walk through the workspace on a regular basis. So, the dresses would be ding-donging me over on the side. I was investing in what supplies and equipment I could afford at the time, but at the time it was pretty bare bones. For example, I now have a Z-rack that my dresses are hanging on. It, however, having said that, is an off-brand Z-rack, so that's going to be a whole discussion here in a second. But at first, I didn't have the money to buy a Z-rack. I knew that that's what I was going to need because, they're long dresses and they're heavy, and I knew that that was going to be a problem. But at the time, I had very limited funding and also somewhat limited space, and I needed something to hang things up on. And for me personally, I also needed some place that I could hang things up that I could close it, because as previously mentioned, I did have pets in the area, and so I wanted to be able to close it up. I ended up spending money on one of those smaller, do-it-yourself, little second closet clothes racks like people buy when they shove their coats in an attic or in a basement, and it had a zipper cover on it, and that was what I used for a while. It was flimsy and problematic that way. It also technically didn't really deter the cats very well because they figured out they could go underneath it if they wanted to bad enough. Fortunately, they never really showed much interest in it, but they could have gotten to it if they wanted to. So I had it for as long as I had it. I might have been able to find somebody to loan me one, or give me an old rack of theirs temporarily. But at that point in time, I had too much stuff just for like a coat tree. I would have maybe 5 or 6 things there at the same time. I needed someplace secure to put them, partially for me looking more professional, but also partially for the clients that were coming in after trudging through my living room, I mean, our house is not great. Our house, it was kind of a mess. We are still, and probably always will be, working on the house. You know, the floor right now is a mess because the carpet's up, but the floor hasn't been finished. You know, like we're the whole kitchen needs to be renovated, and you can see the kitchen. It's just not great. And I feel fortunate that I did have clients very early on who believed in me and accepted the environment that I was working out of temporarily. And so, you know, it was something that was temporary, and then I needed to be able to move on. When I first, okay, so I then, you know, pretty soon started looking to see where I could go, or how, you know, what's the next step? How do I find a different place? How do I get to a different place than where I am right now? And this is going to depend so much on where you live. Commercial spaces can be very expensive. I don't know why. And it's not like you need a huge amount of space, especially not right at the beginning, or maybe never. You don't need massive square footage, but you do need to have a place where you can put your machine and put a rack and an iron and, you know, do some fittings. And so I had my eye for a while on a space that was not far from my home, that was a building that had artist studios in it. And they, you know, the building itself was owned by a nonprofit. The rents for the space were very reasonable. But because of that combination, it was a very popular place for people to rent. And so if something came open, it was gone almost immediately. So I, you know, spoiler alert, that is where I am now, but it was not going to happen right away. Especially, you know, if you're not sure how successful you're going to be and somebody is wanting a deposit and a lease and everything, that's a little scary. And it's okay to struggle a little bit with how to make that decision, how you get brave enough to sign a lease, and when that's a certain amount of bravery, while at the same time knowing fully well that you are outgrowing the space that you're in and it's not going to work long term for you. Just trying to figure out how to make those two things, you know, how to move forward is hard. I did, at least with this, I couldn't get to this space right away. And so I feel like the fact that I did end up waiting longer worked to my benefit. I looked at a lot of other options. Like I said, the commercial space in this area is very expensive. And the financial assistance and grant money and things that are available are very specific and were not applicable. They were, you know, for nonprofit situations, or they were for businesses that were scaling up, or they were for, you know, things that were more, I don't want to say more retail, but that kind of thing. It just wasn't right for what I needed. So I didn't, you know, have the chance to use those. And when you're struggling to even decide if you're going to move out of your house or not, looking at, you know, $1,000 a month on a lease for space is a little much to think about. It's still, to me, that's a lot to think about. It's a lot of overhead. And you know that you're going to have to adjust your overhead when you move out of your house, but that's a lot of unknowns. So I went looking around trying to figure out options. And I asked friends. I asked in the small business groups that I was in. I asked in the community groups I was in if anybody had a space. I was comfortable with the halfway, and this may be very viable, and it is still something that a lot of people do. The idea of doing fittings someplace else and then bringing the things back home to work on them. So the studio would still technically be in my house, but it would get rid of the element of having clients coming in the house. I thought that that would probably be a pretty reasonable thing to do for a while. I think that that would work for a lot of people. If you already know somebody who has space that you may work at, if you have a connection, let's say if you are doing a lot of bridal, if you have a connection with a bridal shop that isn't doing on-site alterations, that doesn't have an alteration person's on site, they might be willing to let you do fittings for their clients there, and then you take the dress and bring the dress back there. They may be willing to do that for you. You may know people who own clothing stores or boutiques, or anywhere really that you could bring your stuff in, set up in a little corner and do some fittings. Any place that has a fitting space, like dressing room space, you could do that and see if you can find somebody who will let you do that for free, if it's a friend, or for a small amount of money, or if you can strike up some sort of bartering or deal. A lot of people will do that, and they will set up with like boutiques, and in exchange for being able to use their fitting space, you do minor repairs. Like if merchandise in the store gets damaged, you'll fix it for them. Get creative with that. You have the creative thing in you. Get creative with being able to find the next step of where you're set up at and how you're doing your space, and not jumping straight into having your own studio. That halfway of using somebody else's space for fittings and then sewing at your house. Yes, it's problematic. It's kind of a pain in the butt, hauling back and forth, traipsing around with, having to carry things back and forth, having to drive back and forth. But if you're more comfortable with that, then that's a good option. That could be a good option for you from the beginning. If you're not comfortable having people in your home, it's just finding someplace else where you can do the fittings and then doing the sewing in your home, period. You can still do the job that way. I personally was not uncomfortable with having people in my home from a safety issue or from like an awkwardness issue that way. My concern was the fact that my house was just not a really great house, and I was worried that it was giving people not the best impression, just because it wasn't, we're not dirty, it's not trashy, but it definitely looks like we're in the middle of doing some remodeling, and unfortunately it looks like that all the time. I just think that that's the way that older houses are, right? You're always kind of in the middle of like fixing stuff. And that's what people were walking into. And like I said, I also had the pets, which wasn't a problem, but could have been a problem. You need to kind of look at your individual situation, the place where you live, the people that you know in that area, and kind of plot that out, that arc. And it doesn't have to go that far. You could run a very successful business for the goals that you want out of using somebody else's space for fittings and then sewing in your spare room. You could run a successful business that way. So maybe that's it. Maybe you are comfortable having people in your home and have a space that you can dedicate, and that the space is, you think is appropriate and suitable for what you need, and you're done. Maybe you've got a nice garage that you can convert over pretty easily and take it one step at a time, and you can just take 3 steps from your kitchen to your work and do that for as long as you want. Maybe you are in a situation where you need to get out as quickly as possible into a different space, and you're going to have to look a little harder to figure out what is going to work for you. Don't discount anything. You know, get in social media groups for the community and ask around. Get in small business groups for the community and ask around. Look around. I did end up talking to and meeting with several people who I thought had potential to be the place or a useful place for me to be able to do that. And in the end, as I was trying to make those decisions, what did happen is that I had a space open up in the building that I am in now with the artist studios. And so the decision was made for me in some great karma thing that happened, because this was where I wanted to be. I am not in the studio that I started in, though. I'm in a much larger studio now, and that's a whole, different step of a story. But at least I got myself in the building and got a separate studio set up in a space that I could set up appointments and I could get in anytime I wanted, which, sometimes if you're using somebody else's space, obviously you're having to deal with what hours they will be there and how you can access and set appointments, because it's not your space. But think about how far, what your ideal is, where you want to be working. Is that out of your home? Is it out of a separate space? Is it sewing in your home and going out? You can do, to a certain extent, there's a market for doing fittings at other people's homes. And some places, will do that. They will come to you. They will come to your workplace and pick your stuff up. You can have your bridal and your bridesmaids fitting in your home and have a little party out of it. And I had started out at one point doing that, being like, hey, if you want to have your bridal fitting and your bridesmaids at your home, we can do that. My logic being is that, there was going to be enough business coming in off of something like that to make it worthwhile for me to go to somebody's house. If you go into other people's homes, though, keep in mind that your overhead again has changed. You're putting miles on your car, and the extra time of you traveling to those fittings is something that needs to be taken into consideration, either in your hourly rate or just a flat rate that you charge as a fee for if you're doing an in-home fitting. There are safety issues with that, obviously, too, so you need to be very careful about how you handle that. That when I did it, I didn't go by myself. I had a friend who could go with me as sort of an assistant, if you will, but it was somebody else who could go with me, so I would feel more comfortable with it. So there are lots of options there. Think about what it means to you and to your business, from your, you are a creative person and you have dealt with having to figure things out before, kind of on the fly, and having to figure out creative solutions to problems. So think about your end goal. Think about what it is that you, in the end, are wanting to do. I mean, the studio that I'm in here, I think is fine for me indefinitely. I'm happy where I am. I'm in a bigger studio than I started out with, so I am comfortable with the size of the space, and I know that this space can handle the amount of work that I want to be able to do in the end. I am comfortable with the idea of who I'm renting from and the way that it's set up for access and all of the other parts of it. I'm comfortable with that. I don't have the desire to own a retail space. I don't have necessarily the desire even to rent a freestanding shop. Where I'm at right now, I have 24/7 access to the building, but, you know, my rent payment is an inclusive payment, and includes, so I don't have to mess around with setting up the electric bill and all this other stuff. It's all included there. Somebody else does the maintenance, somebody else, does the cleaning out in the hallway and the lobby area, and there are hassles with it, yes. But the benefits of being in here far outweigh the hassles of it, to the point where I don't have any interest right now of even looking for any place else. I can grow in this space for quite a while. So, what does that look like to you? What is that looking like for you? Like I said, when I first started, that was pretty much the first immediate problem that started to rear its head, was that the space that I was in was definitely going to be temporary, and I definitely needed to start moving toward a different solution. So look at where you're at, look at your space, try to figure out what your ideal is that way. And I know your ideal is not, a huge store with multiple employees and you hold away in an office someplace, managing people and not touching anything, or, I know that that's not what you're wanting, because you wouldn't be 12 videos into this process with me if that's what your goal was. You would have gone a different route. Figure out what you want to do with that, and start making plans. What is it, what is the measure of how you know that it's time to get out? How much money do you need to be making a week before you start looking at different spaces? Or how many hours a week are you going to be working? Or how many clients a week before you start looking at the next step? Put those safeguards in place for you. Is it that you're waiting for your tax refund to make the leap? That's fine. Are you waiting for something else to happen? Are you talking to a friend who wants to open a shop also, and you want to go in together? Figure out what that is for your space, because if you're starting out at home, this is going to come up pretty quickly, and you're going to really need to think about what those benchmarks are for you and what you're comfortable with. So I'm going to finish this dress. I need to do a little ironing. Can't do that from here. So I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll be back later.